Hello, everyone. I want to start today by introducing myself. My name is Kendal Rolley. I work at a K-12 bilingual school in Hanoi, Vietnam. I focus on the secondary and high school part, but of course still under the umbrella of younger learners. My role is as the PDQA coordinator, the Professional Development and Quality Assurance Coordinator. So my responsibility in terms of the presentation today is ensuring that staff members are able to cope with new challenges such as online learning. And I do that in collaboration with the head of our educational technology department at our school, because those are two things that are inextricably linked. In the last period of online teaching, I was the English coordinator, but there is potential now that we're going to have to start off this school year online due to another outbreak in Vietnam. So as it happens, we are internally reviewing how our online learning went last time and reviewing. So a perfect time to reflect and to think about how to best proceed going forward. I understand that my context is different to a lot of you that are probably watching this video right now, as I'm doing this for the Japanese Association of Language Teachers, and I am in Vietnam. However, I'm a JALT member, and I saw the call for submissions, and when I saw it, I hoped that my experience could be relevant. As such, I'm going to provide a relatively pragmatic and specific recount of what happened in our institution and aimed more towards the classroom implementation side. First, I'd like to talk a little bit of the context that we're dealing with here and the timeline of COVID as it applies to Vietnam, as that's quite important. So Vietnam reacted quite swiftly and stopped flights from China in the early days of February. So we actually never came back in Vietnam from our Lunar New Year break back into the classroom. It was before a full lockdown of the city and the country, so we had the chance to get together as teachers and work out a strategy for teaching online. In the first weeks, I guess to buy us a little bit of time, it was a matter of sending home your typical kind of revision packets, lots of materials that are not really designed to be particularly engaging for students necessarily. So when it became clearer that we're going to be doing this for longer, we decided that we needed to get together as teachers to decide a strategy to make sure that this was as successful as possible. In Vietnam, our academic year is from the start of August to the end of May. So we were back for that final month of May, actually, to close out the school year back in the classroom. Now it's looking quite likely that we could be starting the year out online. Our start date's already been pushed back at my school for 3 weeks due to another outbreak in Vietnam. So more than ever, we are reflecting on the last iteration of online learning and what we can do next time, if we should be changing things, and if so, what, and making sure that we also celebrate the successes that we had. One reason I wanted to deliver this presentation is I think we in my institution as teachers were quite proud of the way that our students mostly continued to be engaged throughout the online learning process. And we also managed to meet a lot of the learning outcomes we'd hoped for. I'm not saying by any means it was perfect or even as good as being in the classroom, but I thought it might be worth sharing some successes because, as I said, overall, we were quite proud of how everything went. The starting point for us was straight away deciding how synchronous or asynchronous we wanted the learning to be. Many of you would be aware that there are advantages and disadvantages to both methods. If you're not 100% sure, synchronous means delivering an online lesson live, while asynchronous is designing the lesson so that it can be studied at different points, not necessarily during a set time frame. Synchronous learning provides quite a lot of structure, and especially for younger learners, and in particular our grade 6 to 8 learners who are 11 to 13 years old. Providing that structure can be really important, especially at a time when people are feeling uncertain and, the world is seeming like a different kind of place than they might be used to. Having that support network or that community can be delivered a lot better in a synchronous environment. However, asynchronous provides much more flexibility for students if they miss a lesson for any number of reasons, including not having particular access to a device at the time of the lesson. It allows them to be able to study the content still, and doesn't just mean that they can't follow that day's lesson. It also can help students that take a bit longer to complete work for whatever reason. I think another important method of looking at this is thinking about traditional attitudes towards education. Both Japan and Vietnam have Confucian heritage culture approaches to education, and that often places the teacher quite at the center of the classroom. And we can see that a synchronous lesson that is delivered very similarly to how it would be delivered in a classroom may look more like traditional learning. However, ultimately we decided, and I feel lucky that we were able to decide this, was that a purely synchronous model wouldn't work as well and wasn't fully making use of the technology. Some other schools in Hanoi did use a synchronous model, a fully synchronous model, and actually said that it worked quite well. However, I'm not privy to the metrics for what was considered success in that context. There was some discussion internally in our review ahead of potentially needing to start this next school year off online about whether a synchronous approach would work better. Ultimately, we decided that it would disadvantage some students to the point where they wouldn't be able to gain anything from our lessons. So we have this somewhat hybrid model, a mix of asynchronous lessons with synchronous components where possible. So we often start off the lesson with with something like a Google Meet. For some of you, that would be Zoom, catching up together. We're looking at integrating it in future with screen recording software so that students who can't make it and are studying purely asynchronously can still at least watch the conversation, if not participate in it. And then hopefully, therefore, still feel somewhat connected to the classroom environment. I think ultimately, though, my biggest takeaway in this context, in regards to this, was that the instructions need to be incredibly explicit, especially for asynchronous learning, because you can't negotiate meaning. And you can't, even online, you can't negotiate meaning in the same way that you can in a classroom context. So situations like this can happen where we had a very confused student trying to work out what to do, and was not giving up either. Another point of reflection regarding tools is, with an asynchronous model or a somewhat asynchronous model, the way that the lesson is delivered is even more crucial than normal. I think it's even more important to focus on the learning objective and then work backwards, breaking the lesson down into a series of stages, and then thinking through how each stage can be optimized for the online format to ensure students stay motivated, engaged, that there's a balance of familiar routines with enough variety and social interactions to maintain interest. There are obviously multiple ways to go about this, but we had already familiarized our learners, with the exception of some mid-year enrollments, with a very solid online learning platform. To get quite specific, we organized each lesson in Google Classroom as a classwork assignment. Then we used the topic function to be able to group all of those into one lesson stage. For example, classwork, 23rd of the 3rd. And then that way the students can keep track and teachers can keep track in Google Classroom of all the tasks that they've assigned to students. The benefit of this too, if you're using Google Classroom, you have access to that, is that students can use the to-do function to check which stages of a lesson haven't been completed. It requires some reminding at the start, but eventually helps to build more learner autonomy in an online setting in regards to students checking and making sure that they've completed everything that the teacher has asked them. The task completion for them is very easy to check. In terms of recording and tracking student data, I have to say that we never found a system that didn't necessitate a lot of extra work for teachers. And one thing I'll be looking at from videos from the other participants about is whether someone managed to find a way that all of these extra tasks can be checked without it being quite time consuming, to the point where I know that a lot of our teachers were staying up till quite late at night, just keeping track of the administration. And it's very easy to do when working at home to not have healthy boundaries between work life and home life. Some teachers started off trying to track each student for each stage. So if you've got 6 stages of a lesson and you've got 25 students, that can end up being, just for one lesson, quite extreme. If you're using Google Classroom, I'd encourage teachers to take a look at a program called Classwork Zoom, which is free for educators affected by COVID, and allows some really interesting metrics to see participation, and allows for easy identification also of copy and paste scenarios. So that's a program that links in. It's got some somewhat frightening user permissions that have to be granted. So that's ultimately a call for the teacher and the institution. The final note on tools is that another thing we found as teachers is that it's better to have a core set of programs that you use, a core set of tools, rather than trying to introduce students to a lot of new ones. It can be very tempting because there are a lot of great programs out there and a lot of things to maintain student interest. But while it can be tempting to use the latest shiny and new programs, this has to be balanced with the potential disruptive nature, the time that has to be taken for students to familiarize themselves with these programs. So next time we go online, we're going to be sticking to the Google Apps for Education, Screencastify, which I'm using for this presentation now. It's free under 5 minutes, which forces us to adhere to the principles of making video content short and relevant, and also a program called Edpuzzle, which we found very useful and engaging for students, and which our Vietnamese counterparts also started using. And if you're not familiar, I would really encourage you to take a look. That's Edpuzzle. Some issues with Google Chat and Google Meet are a lack of administrative functionality, as evidenced in this next example. But these apps tend to be constantly changing and updating and improving. So I hope that in the future we can find a way to make sure that the teachers have the ultimate say about what gets posted in those groups. As I touched on a little earlier, the social aspect of education is one thing that can be overlooked a little bit in online learning, that can treat learners as all autonomous units. Especially we thought for our teenage learners that it was very important to try and maintain wherever possible that socialization, which isn't always easy in an online environment, and especially in an asynchronous environment. We facilitated this through trying to have those synchronous components, like I mentioned, whether it be on Google Chat, Google Hangout, things like a program like Flipgrid, which asks students to create video responses and then other students to comment on it. That depends on privacy restrictions, of course, in your context. We used Google Meet. I used it for older learners. There were some things that didn't work as well, as we found that the asynchronous didn't provide enough structure and ability to socialize for the students. So we found ourselves, as time went on in our online learning period, moving more and more synchronous. And of course, when that happens, you start to lose some of the benefits that come along with asynchronous learning, such as the flexibility. And if you're not careful, you can end up alienating that handful of students that aren't able, like I said, for whatever reason, to be there participating live. We found that we moved more synchronous because the students, especially the younger ones, responded well to the structure. Group work can still be facilitated in an online platform, but like I said, it does tend to work better synchronously. Saying that, you can at least allow them to use the comment function or something if they're trying to do it later. So we found things like programs like Google Docs and Google Slides as being really good ways to facilitate group work, having students not only write their own ideas down, but also make part of the task completion commenting or agreeing or disagreeing with another student's suggestion. And at its best, you do see in real time all these students writing their answers, and it feels, at least for the teacher, like as close as you might want or expect in an online format to the classroom. So we have here one of the first activities I did in onlining to get students used to studying in a new format. In this case, I asked some grade 6 students, some of our younger learners, to answer 3 questions to kick off discussion. Firstly, what they'd been doing over the period of time before online learning kicked in. Secondly, asking them to share their worries. This was the early days of COVID, and I was trying to allow a safe place for students to talk through these anxieties, and also what students had learned over the time we'd not been teaching, to also get them to reflect on the fact that learning doesn't always need to happen in a classroom environment and prime them for online learning. We then discussed the answers in more detail in Google Chat. To organize this better later, I switched to asking students to comment on another student's answer, which led to some funny, if not ideal, moment, as one student who was an expert on tsunamis did not take kindly to other students' lack of knowledge about how one could escape it. On reflection, I'm not saying that online learning can't work as well as face-to-face. However, I know in our case that it didn't. I'm still making this video because I know we did better than a lot of other institutions anecdotally, and I'm looking forward to viewing other participant responses to further explore my understanding of how it can work even better. I'll start with some more general challenges before speaking specifically about issues specific to the context that I'm in. So first of all, you know, that ability that you have in the classroom to check understanding, to negotiate meaning, to be able to clarify if students don't understand instructions or tasks, that is something that we didn't fully crack in an asynchronous model. So students can sometimes not be clear about what they're trying to achieve by asking questions. So not just the teacher not providing instructions, but also the students asking questions that are unclear to us. Even worse, not asking questions at all. In a classroom environment, you would pick up on things like body language or a student not doing work, and would be able to question them further to try and find a way to get that student back on task. But you can just not have the same functionality online, at least as far as I'm aware. It's not always possible to support students with higher needs or with special needs. We have some students that gain a lot from being with other students that you pair them with in the classroom, but they don't have that necessarily offline. There can also be a mental block about online learning not having the same value as a classroom environment, and therefore you're not getting the best out of the students. And also, like I mentioned briefly before, some Confucian heritage culture aspects, the dependence on the teacher as the center of the learning, can be challenging in a regular context, but especially when expecting the higher degree of autonomy expected in an asynchronous learning environment. So our debate was about whether our pedagogy should be altered to take this into consideration, compared with our mission at our school to create global citizens, and also the need to expose students to styles of learning in higher education. They're going to study a lot of them in countries such as Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So we can't fully adhere to the cultural expectations in this case about what learning looks like. And it's not what we've been hired to do in many ways. So getting into some more specific issues, we had a couple of times where the students, especially much younger learners, would forget their passwords and then lacked, I guess, the ability to know what to do in that situation. So it usually ended up being resolved by a teacher actually making a call home and then working out that that was the situation and going from there. We have some internet unreliability issues in Vietnam. There's I believe, an undersea cable that stretches from Vietnam to Korea that is attacked by sharks, it seems, regularly. I'm not sure if it's the same one or a series of sharks, but for whatever reason, during some of the online learning period, we lost connection. Not fully, but it would slow right down. And also, as more and more people shifted to working online, that affected the overall internet speed. And so things could get a bit slow. Researching ahead of this presentation, a British Council study found a number of concerns raised by teachers. And I think some of the ones that we certainly related with was fear of cheating. So, for example, a program that I mentioned, Edpuzzle, we had students being able to work out the answer to multiple choice questions by looking at the source code. We found that teachers wanted more guidance on how to plan lessons to be suitable in an online format. We found that we were all dealing and struggling with longer preparation time. And I think anyone who's planned a fully asynchronous lesson in particular will understand that. We had challenges with including disadvantaged learners who perhaps don't have the same access to technology. So there were a number of concerns. But I'd like to move on now and talk about some of the lighter side, the opportunities that came with this online learning. Research shows that providing students, especially teenage learners, with a later start time can really improve performance and is much more conducive to learning. In our period of online learning, we did not have art or music classes. We didn't have physical education, obviously. We didn't have things like study hall and homeroom. So we were able to tighten up the timetable quite a lot and to be able to start at a later time. During the normal year, with the demands on what we have to cover with transportation arrangements, family arrangements, it's very hard to implement an earlier start. And with students, some of them coming from quite far distances to our school, they can end up getting up a lot earlier than they really should physiologically. In some individual cases during our online learning, some students really flourished in the online environment in a way that we didn't see from them in class time. This was sometimes due to the fact that they're distracted by socialization in a way in class that they aren't online, or sometimes some students feel more comfortable expressing themselves in an online or typed format. So for longer responses, the quality of work can end up being quite a lot better. One thing that I really found that was very beneficial to students, and I could do this during normal classroom teaching, but it certainly came out of this need to provide feedback to students, was we have students, what I would do is I would open up their written assignment for the first time and I would live react using Screencastify to what I'm seeing. And that not only provided students with feedback on how to improve their writing, but also maybe sort of a greater understanding of the process. So that was something really interesting. The students said that having not only that corrected work, but also my reaction looking at it made them feel like they were a little bit more back in class, and also gave them better feedback overall that they could really use. Towards the end of the online learning period, I asked one class that I considered a particular success story to share with me their opinion about online learning. This was a class with quite a low ability compared to some of their peers in other classes, and a class that can be challenging to manage in the classroom. And so it was quite surprising how well they all did online. The work being produced was very good, and they were all quite engaged, and the attendance was, as you can see, extremely high. So I found that through this and my discussions with students overall, that despite doing quite a lot of work at home, the students still largely enjoyed the experience, despite being at the age of 14, where socialization is so crucial. The students who were scoring 4 or 5 here, these 4, were also students that tended to be ones that didn't do much work online. and didn't seem to really grasp that this was a mandatory and serious process, and perhaps also lacked that message being reinforced at home as well. I feel that all that we can do, especially in the context of younger learners where we're communicating largely with parents rather than the students individually about their progress, is to try and maintain a consistent message, to have pride in what we do and know that it has value, to communicate clearly when work isn't being done, and to allow students to come back into the fold as well. That was one thing. I think that some students felt that they'd missed so much work that there wasn't any point in them coming back. But certainly we tried to provide opportunities. Of course, perhaps they're just happy to be online because they can sleep in and maybe play more games and things than they normally would get to. But we hope that the online learning experience was still also quite enjoyable for them. So you can contact me if you're interested, and follow me. I blog very intermittently at insidetefl.com or on Twitter at insidetefl. Hope you enjoyed this presentation today. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing the other contributions from teachers.